Hi, I'm Dave Vickers and welcome to the Photo Show. In today's episode, we're doing the fifth part of our basic photography course. Now, in the previous episodes up to now, we've been looking at the parts of the exposure triangle. We've been looking at shutter speed, aperture and ISO, and explaining how each of those work to control the light that reaches the sensor in your camera. What we're going to do in this episode is look at exposure and show you how you start to put those three things together, the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO, to get the correct amount of light to reach the sensor to create the image that you want. So what do I mean by exposure? Exposure is the point when a certain amount of light reaches the sensor in your camera to record an image. As I've said in the previous episodes, photography at its most basic is recording light to create an image. And by understanding exposure, you'll understand how to control the amount of light that reaches the sensor to record the image that you want to create. So how do we know what the exposure settings are for any particular situation? So the exposure settings are going to be made up of the three things: your initial base ISO setting, your aperture setting, and your shutter speed setting. If something is out of balance and too much light reaches the sensor, that's going to cause the image to be too bright, and this is what's called overexposed. If something is out of balance the opposite way and not enough light is reaching the sensor, your image is going to be too dark, and that's what's called underexposed. As I was explaining in an earlier episode, if you think of it like a seesaw or a set of balance scales, when you have the correct amount of light reaching your sensor, everything is perfectly balanced. If one of the settings is wrong or is changed, it goes out of balance and you're either going to end up with a photo that's too dark and underexposed or too light and overexposed. So how do we know when we've got these settings correct? Luckily, with modern cameras, they have an exposure meter built into them, and this measures the amount of light that reaches the sensor. Now, your exposure meter will probably look something like this. And you'll see that either looking through your viewfinder, or if you're using the screen on the back, it can be displayed on the live view as well. And as you can see by this exposure meter, it's separated into two halves, with a central point with a 0 at the top of it. Now, the center point on your exposure meter is showing you when you have the correct amount of light reaching the sensor for the lighting situation you're in. If your exposure meter is reading more to the plus end, then you're letting in too much light and your image will be too bright and overexposed. If your exposure meter is reading more towards the negative end, then you're not letting in enough light and your image will be too dark and underexposed. So how do we work out how to allow the correct amount of light to reach the sensor and therefore have a correct exposure reading? What I've done is I've made a little setup in the garden. What I'll do, we'll go out there now and I'll show you how you get the correct exposure settings by adjusting your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO.
To try and demonstrate exposure for you, what I've done is I've made a little setup in the garden here. Obviously, in these days of lockdown, we're a little bit restricted of where we can go and what we can do. So I've just put a few objects on a table in the garden and we're going to see what we can do from there. The first thing I'm going to do, if I put the camera onto auto, and we'll let the camera decide what the settings are going to be. So with using auto, you're letting the camera decide all of your settings. So let's put the camera on auto. And I'm using the live screen here, but everything you'll see here, you'll be able to see through your viewfinder on most cameras. You can see now the camera's in auto. So let's half press the shutter. And that's given me a set of exposure values. It's given the ISO at 400. It's giving the aperture at f6.3. And it's giving it 1/250th of a second. So let's take that photo. And as we can see, it's a perfectly nice photo. It's done a really good job. The auto's worked exactly as you'd expect. Let's have a look at those numbers. It's got ISO 400, f8 at 2/50th of a second. So let's go back to putting the camera onto manual. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the camera manually to those settings. So it's 2/50th of a second at f8. And you can see here we have our little meter at the bottom here. This will be exactly the same as it will be within your viewfinder, but you can see the meter's ever so slightly to the negative side, which is saying that that image is going to be underexposed. It's not getting quite enough light to create the perfect exposure. So we have a couple of choices here. What we need to do is we need to be letting more light reach the sensor. Now we've got a couple of choices on these settings. At 1/250th of a second, we can lower that down to 1/200th, and as you can see now, our exposure meter is bang on the center. So let's take that image. There we go, it's done a lovely job of taking that photograph. The other one is put it back to 250, The other option we have, now you can see that I've put it back to 250. The exposure meter is slightly on the low side. And the other option here we have is to change our aperture. Now at the moment it's on f8 and we want to be letting more light in, so we want a wider aperture. So we're going to go down to f7.1 on this camera and we'll take the shot. And there we go. If I now scroll between those two images, you can see exposure wise they're exactly the same, even though they were taking on different settings. So what we're doing is we're controlling the amount of light that reaches the sensor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this from a baseline start now, using the rules that I've been teaching over the last few lessons. Now you can see here the camera's set on ISO 400. Now we're outside in the bright sunlight, so we want to use the lowest ISO we can possible. So I'm going to bring that down to ISO 100. So at these current settings, with the camera at ISO 100, 1/250th of a second at f8, you can see that the meter is showing that we are underexposing. We're not getting enough light reaching the sensor. So let's take that photograph. And you can see there from the image, you can see it's way underexposed. It's not got enough light reaching the sensor to create an image. Let's start by opening up our aperture. So we're on f8 at the moment. Let's come down the aperture settings. And you can see as I'm scrolling down the aperture settings, the metering is coming closer to the center and the 0. And there we go. That's now bang on 0. So that's 100 ISO at 2/50th of a second, f3.5. Let's take that image. And there we have it, a nicely exposed image, absolutely perfect. Let's put the f-stop back up to f8. Let's say that what we wanted to do is we wanted to keep it on f8. Our next option now is that we have to change our shutter speed. So we're keeping the aperture on f8 and we're going to change the shutter speed this time. So as I bring the shutter speed down, again you can see the metering start to move towards the center. 25, 100, 80. And there, at 1/50th of a second, we're balanced up again as we were. So let's take that photograph. And there we go, once again, perfectly exposed photograph. And that's a perfectly exposed photograph on two different settings. Our original setting was 1/250th of a second at f3.5 with an ISO of 100. We've now taken virtually the same exposure shot at 1/50th of a second at f8. So this is where you start to get control over how your image is going to look. For example, if we now up our aperture right the way up to f22. So we're going to have to lower our shutter speed right down. Now I'm on a tripod, so this is allowing me to go a lot slower than you would normally. What I would suggest if this was the case was you change your ISO, but just as an example, we're now down to 1/6 of a second at f22. Now we're going to take that photograph. And you can see from that image that we're getting what's called a good depth of field. We can see from the foreground here into the background is consistently reasonably sharp. Using your aperture and your shutter speed, you're able to control the finished look of the image. Let's now open the aperture right up to its widest aperture, which is 2.8. And you can see now we are way overexposed. So let's take that photograph and see how that looks. So that image is way overexposed. We've got way too much light reaching the sensor. So our option here is we want to use f2.8, so we're going to have to change our shutter speed. So our shutter speed is going to have to get faster. And there we go. 1/200th of a second, 1/250th, 1/400th of a second puts our metering back in balance. Now let's take that photograph. And again, we've got a really balanced exposure photograph, but this time our depth of field is much shallower. You can see that the flowers in the background are much more blurred than they were in the previous shot where we were at f22. So by changing the exposure settings, it's giving us control over the depth of field within the image. And you've got the same option to use if you're using the shutter speed. If you're looking to freeze a subject or show movement, by using a faster or slower shutter speed will allow you to do that. But what we're looking for here is to balance out our exposure. And we can do that by adjusting the ISO. We've kept the ISO as a baseline for ISO 100 because we're in the bright sunlight. And what we've done is we've adjusted the aperture and the shutter speed to compensate for the amount of light required to take the image. This is where you get to what's called equivalent settings. I'm quite often asked, what's the right exposure setting for X situation? And it's impossible to say because one, I don't know the lighting conditions, and two, it really depends on what you want to do. So at the moment we're at 400 of a second, f2.8. If I shut the aperture size down to f5.6, you can see now that our exposure is way down. We're now changing our shutter speed. That's going to have to get slower to allow more time for light to reach the sensor. So we'll bring that down. Now we're at 100th of a second at f5.6. Let's take the image. And we're getting exactly the same exposure value, but from different settings. So these are equivalent settings. So if I now bring my shutter speed up to 200, you can see now that we need to adjust our aperture to bring our metering back into line. So we've increased the shutter speed, so it's letting less light in. So we need to open our aperture up to allow more light back in to compensate. And there we go. 1/200th of a second at f4 is giving us the same exposure value with a different set of settings. All of these will get you the type of image that you want to get. It really just depends on the settings that you want to use. But what we're looking for is a balanced exposure meter here. And you're using the shutter speed, the aperture, and your ISO to achieve a balanced exposure. If you're letting in too much light, the exposure meter will go to the plus end, and that's letting in too much light. If you're not letting in enough light, it'll go to the minus end and underexpose the image. So too much light is overexposing, not enough light is underexposing. What we're looking for is a balanced exposure where exposure meter is right in the center, and to give you a balanced exposure image.
Now we've looked at a real example, hopefully that's given you a bit more understanding in how you use shutter speed, aperture and ISO to control the amount of light that reaches the sensor. But why does changing your shutter speed mean that you have to change your aperture or your ISO to compensate? It's really very simple and hopefully not too difficult to explain, so I'll give it my best shot. With each of the processes that we've looked at within your camera, shutter speed, aperture or ISO, each increment you either go up or down either halves or doubles the amount of light that reaches the sensor. So if you change your shutter speed to one setting slower and your shutter is opening for slightly longer than it was, you are letting double the amount of light in that you were on the previous setting. Conversely, if you speed your shutter speed up by one step and it's opening faster than it was before, you're letting half the amount of light reach the sensor. And the same applies with aperture. For each step that you open or close your aperture setting, you are effectively doubling or halving the amount of light that reaches the sensor. Can you see now that there's a correlation? If you've changed your shutter speed down one step so it's letting half the amount of light reach the sensor that it was, you need to open your aperture up one stage so that it's now allowing double the amount of light that was to compensate. Can you see how that's going to work? If you put your shutter speed up one step so it's opening faster and letting half the amount of light to reach the sensor, you're now going to need to open up your aperture one step to compensate for that loss of light. So you've halved the amount of light that's going through the shutter, but you've doubled the amount of light that's going through the aperture. And therefore you're back to a balanced exposure. And the same goes with ISO. Each time you go up or down a step with your ISO, you're making the sensor half or twice as sensitive to light. So there's a correlation between all three parts, the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed. Each time you change one setting, you're going to have to change one of the other settings to balance it back out and give yourself a correct exposure. Now, one of the questions I get asked all the time is what's the correct exposure setting for X situation? And unfortunately, it's one of those questions that's impossible to answer. It's like asking me how long is a piece of string. If you're saying to me, I'm taking photographs in my garden at midday in July, the lighting conditions at midday in July in London are going to be very different from the lighting conditions at midday in the garden in LA or midday in the garden in Antarctica. The amount of light that's available is always varying, and this is why you need to learn how to read your exposure meter and make sure you're getting the correct amount of light to reach the sensor. I would love to be able to say what you need to do is set it at ISO 100, 250th of a second, f5.6. Unfortunately, that's never the case because you don't know what the specific lighting conditions are where those photographs are being taken. This is why it's important to be able to learn to read your exposure meter and how to balance up your exposure to get the correct exposure for the photos you want. As I've said over and over again, photography is about controlling light to record an image on the sensor. You're using your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO to control the amount of light that reaches the sensor to give the correct exposure to create the photo that you want. So hopefully I've done a reasonable job of explaining what exposure is and how you use the three component parts, your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO, to achieve the correct exposure for the lighting situations that you're working in. I understand a lot of this can be complicated and there's a lot of numbers involved. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. To be honest, with the lockdown going on, I've not got a lot else to do. But for now, I'm Dave Vickers. This is The Photo Show. Please stay safe and well, and we'll see you in the next episode.